It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. During the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign, the term fake news became widely used, mainly by the candidate Donald Trump. Let's listen.
The fake news. They tell you fake news. It's fake news. Fake. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news.
More than ever before, social media became an arena for disseminating information, often false information, to sway public opinion this way or that way. It was originally seen and reported as a masterfully orchestrated campaign by strategic players such as Steve Bannon, who used provocative content and a mixture of truth and false information to bait people into believing things such as Hillary Clinton being involved in a pedophile ring. Only in 2018, a year after Trump was inaugurated, did it become increasingly clear that the manipulation of the social media was not done by individuals or even by political groups and campaigns, but by highly professional companies hired, such as Cambridge Analytica, to design strategies with content of so-called fake news, but also to use complex data mining methods in order to know how to disseminate the information in the most effective way. Now, the method is now, as we know it, is considered what troll farms do. And the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristen Nielsen, said this week that the social media campaign intended to skew the results of the U.S. presidential election in 2016 was a part of a major change in how the internet became a battlefield over public opinion. Let's listen.
We are facing an urgent, evolving crisis in cyberspace. Our adversaries' capabilities online are simply outpacing our stovepiped defenses. In fact, I believe that cyber threats collectively now exceed the danger of physical attacks against us. This is a major sea change for my department and for our country's security. I wish I could tell you that we've rounded a corner, but last year was the worst ever in terms of cyber attack volume. Without aggressive action to secure our networks, it is only a matter of time before we get hit hard in the homeland. 2 years ago, as we all know, a foreign power launched a brazen, multifaceted influence campaign to undermine public faith in our democratic process and to distort our presidential election. Let me be clear, our intelligence community has it right. It was the Russians. We know that. They know that. It was directed from the highest levels.
On to talk about all of this and more with me is Samantha Bradshaw. She's a senior fellow at the Canadian International Council, where she researches computational propaganda. She is also a doctoral candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute, and her dissertation is on the government use of social media to spread disinformation. Now, I thank you so much for joining us today, Samantha.
Thank you for having me.
Samantha, we have just discovered very early this year that Cambridge Analytica was quite involved in the 2016 presidential campaign, and with the Trump campaign in particular, possibly because of their connection to Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon and so forth. But you in the UK just realized that they have also been involved in terms of the Brexit vote and the Brexit referendum, in particular trying to sway people's opinion on Brexit. Tell us about what you discovered about their involvement in the Brexit campaign and how they did it.
Yeah, that's correct. During the time of Brexit, we saw lots of what we call junk news being spread over social media. Junk news is conspiratorial, highly polarizing content that's not necessarily true. So it has an element of what we call fake news to it, but it also includes a lot of that really polarizing content that's designed to divide people. We saw a lot of that being shared over social media, not only in a very like widespread way where there was political bots or bits of code designed to mimic human behavior, spreading and amplifying these messages, giving a false sense of popularity around the messages behind them. But we also saw micro-targeted ads to particular individuals or communities who these messages might speak to more. And a lot of these advertisements were targeted based on our data and the data of the UK voters.
Now, Samantha, this isn't isolated. We know that it is taking place in many other parts of the world. In fact, some of these companies are selling these strategies to the various campaigns, political campaigns out there. Give us a sense of who the main players are in terms of the world of analytica, how Facebook and other social media sites are involved in or used in terms of their strategies as well.
Yeah, so increasingly we're seeing more governments and more political parties turning to social media to exploit these systems to spread junk news and disinformation to voters. In democracies, it tends to be during election cycles where we see political parties hiring companies like Cambridge Analytica to run these campaigns for them. But in more authoritarian regimes where there aren't so many rights, we tend to see disinformation still occurring in these spaces, but it's more of a tool of social control, and it is part of their broader strategy for restricting freedoms online.
And how is Cambridge Analytica using our personal data in Facebook, for example, to target their campaigns?
Yeah, so every time we use the internet, we generate data about ourselves, and social media is included on that. Everything that we click on, it generates detailed profiles about who we are as individuals and who we are as voters. And so Cambridge Analytica has amassed a bunch of this information about populations all over the world, not just in the UK, but also in the United States and other countries as well. And then they use that data then to identify certain communities of individuals and their ideologies and their values. And then that information is fed to the political parties who will then target specific messages to those communities based on their preferences.
Now, Samantha, at least political campaigns in the US are huge periods of time when large amounts of money are spent. It used to be on television and television advertising, but more and more on social media. In your assessment, how much money is being spent on this?
Yeah, so it's really hard to trace the spending of political parties on these sorts of strategies and techniques. Part of the reason is because of the laws around campaign spending and how much political parties are required to report. When we do our field work to interview, bot developers, for example, who are working on the campaigns, a lot of the money we can't actually connect it back to a particular political party. And this is because these are subcontracts of subcontracts. So, a party in the United States might hire a big political communications firm that will then subcontract some of that work out to another company who will require a Facebook specialist, who will then hire a few different people to do certain things on just Facebook. And then there might be a similar contract out for Twitter, a similar contract out for Instagram. And because you're only required to report about 2 levels of spending, you start to lose some of that information. So it's really hard to say exactly how much money each campaign has been spending. When we released a report recently that kind of looked at this phenomenon more globally, we had about 48 countries, and dating back until about 2010, from publicly available information, we found $500 million being spent by governments and political parties on these kinds of strategies. So there's definitely big business behind it, but putting a solid number, it's still very hard to do.
Samantha, if you're on the receiving end of these campaigns by, say, Cambridge Analytica, you are getting a mixture of believable and unbelievable content. That's what makes it so provocative and shocking, and you click on it or you pay attention to it. Tell us the way in which, as you have assessed, the way in which they tailor the content and specifically reach people who are vulnerable to that content.
Yeah, so a lot of the strategies that have been refined for commercial marketing purposes to sell us shampoo or slippers or any kind of commercial goods are now being used in politics. So now we're not only being sold these commercial products, but we're being sold world leaders, we're being sold politicians. And so the content and the strategies that a lot of these companies employ are the same sorts of things that we see in the commercial environment. It's identifying groups of people, it's identifying what they're interested in, what they like, what they don't like, and then tailoring those messages to their preferences.
All right, Samantha, now tell us a bit more here about the way in which this affects the democratic development, democratic processes like elections, as well as democracy itself in many of these countries, how it is now getting manipulated by these companies and campaigns.
Yeah, so in general, for democracy to work, we need to be able to come together, to negotiate consensus, to talk to one another. We don't always have to agree with each other, but it's really important that we have an open platform where people can discuss ideas about politics. We don't want political parties or other interested groups trying to amplify their messages over others. We want people to be able to have organic conversations about, really important topics. And so in terms of how it affects our overall democracy, it really depends on each specific country context. For a lot of emerging democracies, there aren't high levels of media literacy. There's a lot of new people coming online and using these platforms. They may not actually know how to Google for alternative sources of news. And so these kinds of strategies can have a much more deteriorating effect on a lot of the emerging democracies that we're seeing. In countries like the United States and the UK, we've had people that have been using technology for years. I was born on the internet pretty much. I belong to that generation of people who, grew up attached to a computer. But even with that said, media literacy is a really, really important part of this problem.
All right, Samantha, I thank you so much for joining us. There's so much more to discuss because I would like to know if these strategies were used for electing Macron in France, or in terms of what's going on in Brazil with the Lula campaign and so on. And I know all of which various people, if not yourself, are working on in terms of this project. So I would love to have you back, and we can dig further into other such strategies that are affecting our democracies. I thank you today for joining us.
Great. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.